Hi guys, Chapter 2. August 31st, 1803 through May 1804. Seaman stood beside Meriwether aboard the Keno boat, watching the men pull on the oars. The river was low and the keelboat large and bulky, so traveling down the Ohio River was hard work. The hot sun beat down on Seaman's back. He panted, his tongue hanging out of his mouth. Suddenly, Seaman raised his head and sniffed. He trotted past the boat's cabin to the front of the keelboat and stared at the water. Meriwether Lewis followed, curious about what the dog had discovered. Up ahead, the water surface seemed to be covered with furry gray balls, each moving with its own sleek wave. Lewis brushed his hair out of his eyes. "Look at that," he said, a dozen men rowing the boat. Why, those are squirrels! Dozens and dozens, no, hundreds of gray squirrels are swimming across the river. Seaman pranced back and forth eagerly. "All right, Seaman," Lewis said, smiling. "Go get 'em." Lewis trapped Seaman's broad back. The dog needed no further urging. With a leap, he splashed into the river. The boat's crew laughed as Seaman hit the water. On land, the big Newfoundland's thick black coat looked bulky, but in the water he was sleek and graceful as a seal, his powerful legs stroking. Seaman swam into the mass of squirrels and caught one in his jaws. He tossed his head and jerked the squirrel's body into the air, snapping its neck. Then he turned toward the keelboat and swam against the river's current with a limp gray body in his mouth. When he reached the boat, he raised his chin and paddled in place where Lewis leaned over to the side and took the squirrel. Instantly, Seaman turned and swam back toward the squirrels. Seaman repeated the performance again and again. A heap of damp squirrels soon filled the prow of the keyboat. "That's a fine dog," called John Coulter, a lean, muscular member of the crew. He looked at Lewis, a grin on his sun-tanned face. "Have you ever tasted squirrel meat, Captain?" Lewis shook his head no. Makes mighty good eating," Coulter said. "Back in Kentucky, we used to hunt squirrel. The meat's lean and tasty. Makes my mouth water just thinking about the smell of squirrel meat frying in the pan." The men pulled their oars eagerly, thinking about the evening supper. "All this game out there," Lewis shook his head and gazed out over the broad expanse of water. "I never even heard of squirrels migrating across a river." Seaman swam back toward the boat, and Lewis knelt down to take a squirrel from his mouth. Before the dog turned to continue hunting, Lewis said, "That's enough, Seaman." He reached out to pull the dog into the boat. Coulter ran over to help. The big dog scrambled aboard and shook out his long coat. Water sprayed in everywhere, and the men ducked. Grinning, Coulter brushed off his face with his sleeve. "Seaman's a great hunting dog, Captain. Eager to please, happy to work." I'm just letting you see the picture real quick. Lewis agreed. Seaman's willingness to hunt was one more proof that he was the right dog for this coming journey. That evening in camp, Seaman lay beside Lewis, facing a blazing fire. Lewis bit into a piece of fried squirrel meat, and the men watched him chew. "It's delicious," he declared. The men whooped and dug in. Lewis fed a piece to Seaman, who swallowed the morsel in one big gulp. Another man laughed and held out a piece from his plate. Seaman hesitated, looking at Lewis. The dog's furry ears looked cocked, and skinny strings of drool hung by his lips. Lewis nodded. Instantly, Seaman scrambled to his feet. He wiggled his way around the fire, collecting hunks of meat and pats from the men. When Seaman reached John Coulter, he gobbled up the meat and licked Coulter's ear. "That's all right, fellow," Coulter said, laughing. "No need to thank me. You earned the squirrel meat." Lewis watched his men play with the dog. Lewis had commanded soldiers, and he knew the dog reminds men of home, of campfires shared with fathers, brothers, and childhood friends. Seaman could take the chill out of the black nights better than the fire. Lewis watched as his men grinned and patted their big dog. He smiled as Seaman licked their faces and nuzzled their hands. It was only September, and the Ohio River was carrying Lewis and his men to the frontier, to the edge of the white settlements. This trip down Ohio River was really a preparation, a time to hire the men, pack supplies, and make plans. The expedition to the west would begin the following spring, in 1804. First, the group would spend the winter in training near St. Louis, the farthest major settlement in western United States. After St. Louis, there would be a few small settlements, some trading posts, and wilderness that stretched farther than any United States citizen had traveled, farther than most Americans could imagine. Lewis knew that blacker, chillier nights were to come. As explorers, they were going to face the unknown dangers. The expedition would take a year or two to reach the Pacific Ocean and return. When the men felt scared or homesick, the dog would help lift their spirits. Along the banks of the Ohio countryside was mostly forest. Trees lined the river banks, their leaves still green and lush. Days fell into routine. The men awoke with the sun and ate breakfast of leftovers from yesterday's supper. They broke camp, pushed off the boats, and proceeded on their journey. The group rowed downstream each day, struggling to move the heavy wooden keelboat through the shallow waters. Sometimes it snagged, and the men had to lift or drag into the deeper water. River travel on a keelboat was hard work, but it was necessary because the big vessel could be packed with several tons of supplies. The keelboat had a cabin on its flat bottom so that supplies could stay dry and be stored inside. In addition to the keelboat, the group had smaller boats that were easier to handle. 2 canoes and a pirogue.
Pirogue.
Ooh, a pirogue. It's dug out like a canoe, a boat like a canoe. A pirogue looked like a big canoe, except it had a mast so it could be sailed as well as rowed. On September 13th, Seaman was riding up front on the bow of the keelboat. He sat with his face catching the breeze, his tongue sticking out a little, like a pink half-moon on the black background of his fur. Suddenly, Seaman raised his head to study a dark, odd-looking cloud in the distant sky. Sniffing, he stood up and began to bark. In a matter of minutes, the sun was completely hidden, turning morning into dusk. But this cloud did not bring rain. It was a cloud of birds. Passenger pigeons were flying overhead in a thick flock. Lewis shook his head at the wonder of it. So many migrating birds, he thought. What animals will we see out west? The skies darkened on September 15th, this time with rain. It rained for 8 long hours, soaking Seaman, Lewis, and the men. The smell of the wet wood mingled with the smell of wet buckskin clothing. When the rain stopped, another smell appeared. Mildew. Lewis checked a few of the supply boxes and found their contents had gotten damp. What was worse was some of the guns were wet and starting to rust. Lewis groaned. With rusty guns, the men would not be able to hunt. They had to keep the guns in working order. When the boats passed a sunny sandbar 2 days later, Lewis ordered the men to pull up. "This will be a good place to spread out the supplies," he said. The men unpacked clothes and blankets and laid them out to dry in the sun. They took apart the guns, wiped them dried, and oiled them to stop the rusting. Seaman stretched out on the sand and watched the men work. Soon he began to pant in the hot sun. He waded into the river and swam up and down the sandbar. When the dog hopped out, he shook himself, water sprayed on the open boxes and supplies. None of the men scolded Seaman, though. His playful spirit made everybody chuckle. For the rest of the day, Seaman took turns swimming and lying on the sandbar. He fished for rocks under the shallow water, scooped them up with his mouth, and made a little pile of them on the shore. John Colter picked up a stick and tossed it into the river. Seaman leaped into the water after the stick promptly brought it back in his mouth. Colter grinned and rubbed Seaman's wet rump. It took 2 weeks more of the river travel to reach Cincinnati. There, Lewis told the men to make camp. He had ordered more supplies to be delivered to them at this town, and the men loaded the boats. Seaman romped with the men and dozed beside Lewis as he wrote letters. After a few days, they were back on the river, heading southwest. The men set up camp again in Clarksville, where William Clark was living at his brother's home. The plan was for Lewis to go ashore to join Clark, who would be his co-captain in the upcoming expedition. William and Clark came running down the steps, his red hair blazing in the sunshine. He shook hands with Lewis. His eyes danced with excitement. Seaman watched Lewis's face open into a smile. He saw him grab hold of Clark's hand and shake it warmly. He understood at once that Clark was important, a man to trust and obey. Both Lewis and Clark were tall, about 6 feet, and athletic. Both moved big, determined strides, and they were men in a hurry to get things done, confident men. They climbed the steps and sat on the porch, talking in lively, excited voices. Clark's brother joined them, and the three ate and drank, laughing and telling stories. Seaman lay down patiently at the base of the steps where the rich smell of cooking meat drifted to him around the corner of the house. The dog glanced up at Lewis to make sure he was still talking. Then he got up and went to look at the source of that wonderful smell. The door to the kitchen was closed, so Seaman wandered around the yard. He could hear the men on the porch. Seaman set out to explore the nearby outbuildings. At one of the barns, Seaman saw a tall black man at work on some leather straps. The man whistled, and Seaman approached slowly, holding out his muscular hands. The man let Seaman sniff his fingers. They smelled like leather and oil with a fainter odor of the horse fur and hay. "Hey, big fella," the man said softly. At the sound of the man's voice, Seaman took a step back. The black man chuckled. "Now, don't act scared of York. The size of those jaws you have, I should be the one who's scared to go near you." Seaman nuzzled the man's hands. The man stroked Seaman's fur and looked into his deep brown eyes. "I bet you like to play, wouldn't you, fellow?" York jogged into the yard, snatched a stick, and tossed it. Seaman raced after and brought it back to York. He sat with the stick in his mouth until York took it. "Well, you sure know your manners, don't you, fella?" York grinned and tossed the stick a few more times. Then he walked back into the barn to finish his work. Sorry, my nose is itching like I have to sneeze, y'all. Sorry. York chuckled, rubbed his hands together, and wiped them on his pants. As he left the barn, he whistled at Seaman. "Come on, big fella." York walked toward the house, and Seaman bounded alongside his new friend. "Ah, here's York," said Clark when he saw the black man walking through the yard. He waved at York, hopped nimbly into the porch steps. "Meriwether, do you remember my servant?" "Yes, I remember York," said Lewis, smiling and clapping his hands on York's shoulder. "He'd been with you since you were a boy, hasn't he? If my memory serves me, he was a gift from your father, and York's father was a lifelong companion and servant to your father." William Clark nodded. "You have excellent memory." Lewis took a long, careful look at York. Although the fellow was tall and muscular, he was light on his feet as a cat. Lewis sat. "I'm delighted to see that you're enjoying good health, York." Mr. Clark said you're eager to see the West. "Yes, sir," said the black man. "Master William, he likes to see the world, and York goes wherever Master William goes." York gestured to Seaman. "This here dog was wandering around the barns. I haven't seen him before, but he sure is a fine animal. And he belongs to you, Mr. Lewis?" Lewis beamed. "This is Seaman, the Newfoundland I purchased in Pittsburgh." Lewis turned to Clark as he spoke. "I've been well pleased with him. Although he's a young animal, he retrieves game expertly. He is a wonderful swimmer, and he's also quite the hunter. Why, he caught a pile of squirrels for our dinner a few weeks ago, caught them in the water, and snapped their necks and swam right back to the boat with them. We had quite the feast, thanks to Seaman." Y'all, I have to stop right here just for a minute, and I'll start recording again. The video stops after 15 minutes, and we're about at that point, so I'll see you on the next video.